Welcome to this story. This is a tale of love, secrets, and tragedy. A story hidden from history. A romance that was never meant to be. You will step into the world of Eva Braun, a woman who waited, loved, and sacrificed everything for Adolf Hitler. You will hear about their first meeting, their hidden relationship, and the years she spent in the shadows. You will feel her loneliness, her devotion, her hope, and her pain. As the war rages, the walls close in. The world is falling apart, but Eva refuses to leave. She chooses to stay, to love, to follow him to the very end. In this story, you will hear moments of happiness, whispers of doubt, and the final hours inside the bunker. You will feel the tension, the fear, the silence before the end. Are you ready? Listen carefully. Follow the words. Let yourself be drawn into the past. This is not just history. This is a love story like no other. Chapter 1. The First Glance. Munich, 1929. The air smelled of ink and cigarettes. The sound of a camera clicking filled the small photography studio. People moved quickly, arranging lights, adjusting equipment. But Eva Braun stood still. Her hands, usually busy with papers and photographs, rested at her sides. Her breath caught in her throat. He was there, in the doorway. Adolf Hitler. She knew his name, everyone did, but names were different from reality. The man in the newspapers looked cold, serious. The man standing before her was something else. His uniform was pressed, neat. His brown coat hung just right on his shoulders. His blue eyes scanned the room, sharp, searching. Then, for a brief second, they met hers. A strange feeling ran through her. Excitement? Fear? She wasn't sure. "Who is that?" she whispered to a colleague. The answer came in a hushed voice. "That's Herr Hitler. He comes here often." She watched him move across the room. He spoke with the studio owner, Herr Hoffmann, laughing about something she couldn't hear. His voice was deep, commanding. People leaned in when he spoke. They nodded, listened, almost as if under a spell. Eva forced herself to look away. She had work to do. The shop was busy. Customers needed help, but her hands trembled as she reached for a stack of photographs. Her heart pounded, fast and uneven. She told herself it was nothing. Just curiosity. Just nerves. But deep inside, she knew. Something had changed. Hours passed, but the memory of his eyes stayed with her. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought of him again, of his voice, his presence. She closed her eyes, but she saw his face. She told herself it was silly. He was an important man, a leader. He had no reason to notice her. And yet. The next morning, she arrived at work early. The air smelled of coffee and ink. The dark room was already in use. Sunlight streamed through the front windows. The bell above the door chimed as customers entered, their voices mixing with the usual sounds of the studio. Ava went about her tasks, organizing photos, stacking papers, greeting visitors. But part of her was waiting. Would he come again? Days passed, then weeks. The memory of him faded, but never completely. She told herself it had been a brief moment, a passing interest, nothing more. Then, one afternoon, the bell above the door rang again. She turned. There he was. Her breath caught. This time, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by men, all dressed in brown uniforms. Their boots clacked against the wooden floor as they entered. The air in the studio seemed to change. People moved aside, made space. He was speaking, discussing something with Herr Hoffmann. Ava tried not to stare. She focused on her work, flipping through photographs, adjusting frames. But then, "Fräulein," a voice called. She looked up. It was him. Her heart raced. He was watching her now, really watching. A slight smile on his lips. "You work here?" he asked. She nodded, suddenly unsure of her voice. "Ah," he said, looking at her as if studying her face. "And your name?" "Ava," she managed. "Ava," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound. Then he turned back to Herr Hoffmann, continuing their conversation. It was a short moment, barely a few seconds, and yet something about it made her pulse quicken. After he left, she sat down, feeling dizzy. She had spoken to him. He had looked at her, not just as a passing face in a crowd, not just as a shop girl. He had noticed her. That night, she couldn't sleep. She thought about his voice, his presence. She told herself it was foolish, that he was too important, too distant. But deep down, she felt something else. A spark. A beginning. And somehow she knew. This was only the first chapter. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Attraction. The days passed slowly. Each morning, Ava woke with a new hope. Would he come today? Would she see him again? The thought made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was silly, that he was a man of power, a leader. But deep inside, she longed for another moment in his presence. She stayed late at the studio, rearranging photographs, cleaning shelves, finding small tasks to keep her there, just in case he walked through the door again. And then, he did. The bell above the door rang. Boots echoed against the wooden floor. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Ava felt her breath catch. He was there, standing in the doorway just as he had before. His coat was crisp, his movements careful and confident. His eyes scanned the room, searching. And then he saw her. She looked away quickly, pretending to be busy. But her hands shook as she reached for a stack of photographs. She heard his voice, deep and smooth, speaking to Herr Hoffmann. She tried to focus on her work, but it was impossible. Then something unexpected happened. "Fräulein Braun," he said. She froze. Slowly, she looked up. He was smiling now, just slightly. "You seem very busy," he said, amusement in his tone. Eva opened her mouth, but no words came. Her heart pounded in her chest. Herr Hoffmann chuckled. "Ah, our Eva is a hard worker, always here late." Hitler nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "Dedication is important." She swallowed hard. "Yes," she managed. A simple word, one syllable. But it was enough. He had spoken to her. He had noticed her. After that day, everything changed. She no longer had to wait in silence. He spoke to her often when he visited, asked about her work, made small jokes that made her laugh, even when she tried to hold it back. He was not the cold, distant figure from the newspapers. In those moments he was warm, attentive. And then came the first invitation. "Would you join me for dinner?" His voice was casual, but his eyes studied her reaction. Her heart raced. Dinner? With him? She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yes, I'd like that." He smiled. Good. That evening, she dressed with care. A simple dress, soft curls in her hair. Her hands trembled as she fastened the clasp of her necklace. She told herself to stay calm. It was just dinner. But when she arrived, she realized it was not just dinner. It was something more. The restaurant was quiet, private. Candles flickered on the tables. He was already there, waiting for her. When she sat, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I like talking to you," he said. Her cheeks warmed. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, considering the question. "Because you listen," he said simply. And she did. That night, he spoke of his dreams for Germany, his vision for the future. He told stories of his past, of struggles, of triumphs. He spoke of art, music, destiny. Eva listened, enchanted. She had read about him. She had heard the speeches. But here, across the table, he was different. He laughed. He teased. He looked at her as if she mattered. She knew the world saw him as a leader, a force of history. But tonight, he was just a man. Time passed too quickly. When it was over, he stood and took her hand. His grip was firm, warm. He looked into her eyes. "This was nice," he said softly. "I hope we do it again." Eva nodded. She couldn't speak. As she walked home that night, her mind spun with emotions. She knew this was dangerous. She knew he was not an ordinary man. But it was too late. She was already falling. From that night on, she belonged to him. But did he belong to her? That was the question that haunted her. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Shadows. The days blurred into nights. Time passed, but little changed. Eva watched, waited, hoped. She was always waiting, waiting for him to arrive, waiting for him to call, waiting for any sign that she was more than a shadow in his life. When he was with her, she felt alive. His presence filled the room, his voice commanding, his laughter rare but thrilling. He spoke of politics, of war, of destiny. He rarely spoke of love, but she did not need words, or so she told herself. His glances, his occasional touches, the way he let her stay near, these were enough. Weren't they? And yet, doubt crept in, whispering at the edges of her mind. She was never at his side in public, never by his arm at events. He stood alone before crowds, before cameras, before history itself. She stood behind, always hidden. At first, she accepted it. He was important, powerful. He had responsibilities beyond her. But as the years passed, the loneliness grew. She watched as others took their places beside the men they loved. She saw women with their husbands, their fiancés, their families. She smiled, pretending it did not matter. But at night, in the quiet of her own thoughts, she wondered. Would she always be the woman in the shadows? The answer came slowly, painfully. She saw it in the way people spoke of him, the way they admired, feared, followed. To them, he was not just a man. He was more, an idea, a leader, something untouchable. There was no room for love in a life like his. Not the kind she wanted, but she could not leave. She tried once, wrote a letter, packed her things, told herself it was over. And yet, when he called, she went back. Always, she went back. Because when he wanted her, it was as if nothing else mattered. She told herself it was love. Perhaps it was. But love should not hurt like this. She knew deep inside that she would never be first in his life. She would always be waiting. And still, she stayed. Chapter 4. The Lonely Devotion. The pain had no voice. It lived inside her, hidden beneath careful smiles and quiet obedience. She laughed when expected, dressed in fine clothes, stood in the background. But behind closed doors, when the world could not see, the silence swallowed her whole. She was always alone. Days stretched into nights. He was busy, always somewhere else, always surrounded by men in uniform. He spoke with generals, planned strategies, made decisions that changed the world. And Ava? She waited. At home, at the Berghof, in hotel rooms, in the places he allowed her to be. She watched him from afar, proud yet aching. He gave speeches to thousands, his voice commanding, his hands moving with power. The crowds roared, their eyes shining with devotion. But that devotion was never for her. She was not his wife, not even his fiancée. Just a woman he kept close, but never close enough. She wanted more. She wanted to be seen, to be loved, to be chosen. She wanted to know she mattered. But instead, there were whispers, rumors of other women, young, elegant, important, women who did not wait in the shadows, women who did not live their lives in secret. She told herself not to listen, not to believe, but doubt clung to her heart like a disease. Nights became unbearable. She sat alone, staring at the telephone, hoping it would ring, hoping his voice would tell her something, anything to chase away the fear. Sometimes he called. Sometimes he did not. She wrote letters, pouring out her heart. Sometimes he answered. Most times he did not. She felt invisible. One evening, she stood before the mirror, studying the face that looked back at her. Her skin was pale, her eyes tired. What was she to him? A lover? A companion? Or just another piece of his life, something to be kept, controlled, but never truly cherished? The question burned inside her. She reached for the small pistol he had given her. A gift. A gesture of protection, or perhaps of control. Her fingers trembled as she held it. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to understand. A single breath. A pull of the trigger. The sound echoed through the room. Pain. Sharp. Quick, but not fatal. A mistake? A cry for help? The bullet missed its mark, only grazing her. But the message was clear. She had given everything. And still, it was not enough. The news reached him quickly. He was furious, not afraid for her life, not heartbroken by her pain. Furious. How could she be so foolish? How could she embarrass him like this? He sent her flowers, a note, but no promises. He did not come to see her. She had risked her life to make him notice her, and still she waited. Because despite everything, she loved him. Despite the loneliness, despite the silence, despite the pain, she could not walk away. Even if she knew, deep inside, that she would never truly have him. Chapter 5. The Berghof. Their secret world. The drive to the mountains always felt like an escape. The air grew cooler, the roads quieter. As the car climbed higher, the noise of the world faded. The worries, the whispers, the loneliness, they all seemed smaller here. The Berghof stood on the hillside, grand and silent. Wide windows opened to breathtaking views of the Alps. The green valleys stretched below. The peaks stood like watchful giants. It was a place of beauty, untouched by war, a world apart. Here, she was not just waiting for him. She was with him. She walked the gardens in the morning, feeling the grass under her feet. The sun warmed her skin. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air. In the afternoons, she joined him on the terrace, sitting for hours, listening as he spoke. He talked about politics, about history, about the future. She smiled, nodding in all the right places. She laughed when he expected her to. She listened, always listened. The days passed in an easy rhythm, long breakfasts, coffee served on fine porcelain, newspapers spread across the table. Sometimes he showed her a photograph or pointed out a passage from a book. These were the moments she cherished, small glimpses of a life that felt almost normal. The evenings were the best. Music played softly from the radio. Friends and officers gathered around, sharing stories, drinking wine. He was more relaxed here, less distant. Sometimes he let her take his arm. Sometimes he even danced with her. She lived for those moments. She captured them with her camera. The mountains in the background, the sun casting golden light. He did not mind being photographed here. At the Berghof, he was in control. In those photographs, they almost looked like a couple. A real couple. But the illusion never lasted. There were meetings, long discussions behind closed doors. Telegrams arrived, urgent and secret. Generals came and went, their faces serious. The war was always there. She tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it did not matter. But even at the Berghof, she could feel it creeping in, tightening around them. He changed. His mind was elsewhere, his temper shorter. He stayed up late, pacing, talking to himself. Sometimes he barely noticed her at all. She asked him once if he was tired. He waved her away. There was no room for weakness, no room for distractions. She was a distraction. Still, she stayed. Because even when he was distant, even when he forgot her for days at a time, this was the only place where she felt close to him. She told herself this was enough. But deep inside, she knew. The world beyond the mountains was waiting. And soon, even this place, this secret world, would not be safe. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. A Love That Was Never Enough. The world outside was falling apart. Bombs shattered cities, sirens wailed through the night, and fear spread like a sickness. But none of it changed the way she felt. She stayed. She could have left. Others did. Friends disappeared. Officers vanished. Women packed their bags and ran to safer places. But she could not, would not without him. People whispered about her, called her naive, foolish, a woman wasting her life for a man who would never truly be hers. But what did they know of love? She had spent years waiting for him, standing in the background, learning to be patient. She had accepted the secrecy, the silence, the loneliness. She had smiled through the rumors, the betrayals, the nights spent alone. This was no different. She told herself that love was not measured in words, that it did not need promises, that his actions, keeping her close, letting her stay, meant more than anything he could say. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, doubt crept in. She watched him grow colder, more distant. His eyes, once sharp and full of fire, now burned with exhaustion. His shoulders hunched under the weight of failure. The war had turned against him, and he knew it. She saw it in the way he spoke, in the way he moved. The anger, the frustration, the paranoia. He lashed out at those around him, trusted no one. She wanted to help, wanted to take his hand, tell him he was not alone. But he would not let her. He never had. Still, she stayed. She told herself it was enough to be near him, even when he barely looked at her, even when days passed without a single touch, a single glance. She clung to the moments when he did notice, the rare smiles, the brief conversations, the nights when he allowed her to sit beside him. She convinced herself that this, too, was love. But in the deepest part of her heart, she knew. She would never be his wife. Never be the woman he chose above all else. He had already made his choice. His bride was Germany. And now, as the war crumbled, as the walls closed in, she realized something else. Germany had betrayed him, and she was all he had left. She would not leave him. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 7. The Bunker. Their final hours. The walls shook with distant explosions. Dust fell from the ceiling. The air was damp, thick with smoke and sweat. In the narrow hallways, officers whispered, their voices low and urgent. The world outside was ending. But in the bunker, time moved slowly. She did not care about the war anymore. The maps, the reports, the panicked footsteps rushing back and forth. None of it mattered. Not to her, because after all these years, she had finally heard the words she had longed for. We should be married. Her heart had raced. She had searched his face for doubt, for hesitation. There was none. His voice was steady, his decision final. The world had taken everything from him. His armies were broken, his empire gone. But in this last moment, he had given her something, a place beside him, a name that could not be erased. She felt no fear, only a strange, quiet happiness. The wedding was nothing like the ones she had imagined as a girl. No flowers, no church bells, no grand white dress, only the dim glow of candlelight, the distant echoes of war, and a few solemn witnesses. She signed her name with steady hands, Eva Braun. And then, for the first time, she became something else, Eva Hitler. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to hold on to this feeling, but there was no time. The walls trembled again. The war crept closer. The men around them spoke of defeat, of betrayal, of the end. But she did not listen. For one night, she was a bride. One last toast. Glasses clinked in the dimly lit room. She looked at him, memorizing his face, His hair had grayed, his eyes dark and hollow. The weight of the world hung on his shoulders. Still, she smiled. She asked for music. Someone found an old record. A melody filled the bunker, soft and distant, a ghost of another time. She held out her hand. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he took it. One last dance. The steps were slow, unsteady. There was no rhythm, no grace. But she did not care. For a few minutes, they were alone in the world. Her head rested against his shoulder. His hand pressed lightly against her back. The war, the fear, the darkness, they disappeared. She closed her eyes, holding on to the moment. She had waited 16 years for this. Now, it was over. When the music stopped, he pulled away. He looked at her, his face unreadable. "It's time," he said. She nodded. She had known this was coming. There was no future beyond this bunker, no tomorrow. But she was not afraid. She had made her choice. She would follow him. Always. Chapter 8. The Wedding and the End. The bunker was silent. The air was heavy, thick with smoke and despair. Outside, the city burned. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the tunnels, but down here, deep beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, time had almost stopped. Ava sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. 16 years she had waited for this. She had stood in the shadows, watching, hoping. She had endured whispers, silence, loneliness, but not anymore. Now, she was his wife. It did not matter that the wedding had been simple, rushed, without joy. There was no need for flowers or music, no time for celebration, only a piece of paper, a few witnesses, and a promise that had come too late. She had taken his name, but she had no future to wear it. The bunker walls pressed in around them. Maps lay scattered across the tables, marked with the ruins of a lost empire. Officers moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. They all knew what was coming. There was no escape. She knew it too. But she was not afraid. She had never been afraid of death. She had lived too long in waiting, always standing at the edge of his world, never fully inside it. Now, at the end, she belonged to him completely. He sat across from her, silent, lost in thought. His shoulders hunched forward, his fingers drumming softly against the table. His face, once full of fire, was pale, worn. The war had taken everything from him. She reached for his hand. He let her. The simple touch sent a wave of warmth through her. How many times had she longed for this? To feel close to him, without walls between them? Now, at the end, there were no barriers. They had made their decision. She did not ask if he was sure. There was nothing left to say. A glass was placed before her. The liquid inside was clear, still. She lifted it slowly, her hands steady. For the first time in her life, she was not waiting for him. This time she would go with him. No more lonely nights. No more unanswered letters. No more silence. She met his eyes one last time, and then she drank. The poison burned. A final breath. The world faded, and at last the waiting was over.